I don't know if like this part is gonna be. Are we starting or are we just like
Yeah,
hanging
yeah,
out?
we
Okay.
are recording already, so I
Okay.
guess we are like starting like smoothly, just
Okay.
entering,
Okay. Perfect. I love this.
Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social actions, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrivka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. We use them all the time. Metaphors allow us to make sense out of things we cannot comprehend. What metaphors do we commonly use to understand microbes? Bacteria are bugs, and we are certainly at war with them. Such a stand contributes greatly to our antagonistic relationship with microbes. But can we revalue our relationship with microbes through metaphors? Could metaphors help us reconsider habits and economies related to our coexisting with bacteria, particularly something as serious as antimicrobial resistance? On this episode of Ferment Radio, we look for answers to these questions with Jessica Maccaro, a PhD candidate at the McFrederick Lab, University of California, Riverside, working with insects, fungi, and science communication.
Metaphor is important because it literally allows us to make sense of something that we don't understand. It's kind of like because the only way we can comprehend a new thing is by mapping it to like what we know already, and that's sort of the role of metaphor. And this guy, Doug Hofstadter, he's like a linguist and artificial intelligence person, and he's kind of all over the place, but he thinks about metaphor and analogy as actually the core to cognition for humans. And he says we do it all the time. Like, we look at something, like I'll look outside and I'll see like the trees moving. It'll remind me of movement at a different memory in time. And like I will just unconsciously start drawing connections between these things, like, and so metaphor is happening on a cognitive level, I think, for us more than we like to recognize. I think we like to think we're rational and usually just following deductive processes and logic to understand the world, but I think there's a lot of subconscious metaphor and analogy that is basically important to us understanding new stuff and just relating to anything in our environment. So could not agree more about metaphors as being important.
Maybe, in a very non-linear way, I wanted to jump to the question which maybe one could expect at the beginning. I would like you to tell us from what kind of perspective you are looking in this case, in this conversation on the metaphor. So basically, what are you up to? What are you doing?
Well, so I'm a graduate student at UC Riverside, and I'm mostly like doing research, specifically like on microbes and microbiomes of bees. So this metaphor stuff is very much like a side hobby of mine, and I'm just generally always thinking about language because I'm also interested in science communication, and science communication is a big part of like how I've designed my training through my program. It's something I dedicate a lot of time to and read about, and so I started thinking about metaphor in that framework of like actually being able to like communicate science more effectively. And then as I started reading more and more about communication, I started thinking about kind of what you brought up with how metaphor is also connected to emotion, and how the metaphor you choose gives you a particular affect and a particular frame in how to perceive that new thing you learned about through metaphor, but also, you know, as from a research perspective, the kinds of questions that you begin to ask about that thing. So if we're talking about metaphors about microbes, you know, the way that the metaphors that we have to understand microbes also frame the way that we can go about solutions to them. And so that's like from a scientist as well as from a public understanding, because, we usually think of scientists as being separate from the public and that we can explain things objectively, like you were talking about. But like language is always like being used as a way to represent something. And so the way that you represent the world is never objective, really. Because it's never just a one-to-one mapping of reality. And so I think that's something that science communicators don't think about enough, of just like the metaphors they use. A lot of the focus is on basically how can we make information more decipherable and easy to understand, and not thinking about the connotation of the content that they're putting on it through the metaphor. And so the microbes are a great example. Like there are metaphors that are supposed to be more just descriptive, right? Of like, let's say you call a microbe a bug, right? Like that's I think just a way that people try to convey their smallness. It's like, okay, like we know bugs, compared to us, bugs are small. So microbes are like bugs, but smaller, like they're small, right? So that's like the feature that the metaphor is trying to get you to focus on. Like that's the other thing about the metaphor, right? Is it frames a specific feature as being important. So through that connection, you're now thinking about size when you think about microbes. But then, there's these other types of of metaphors that I think are really interesting, which are the kinds that are useful in telling us how we should relate to the things around us and like how they relate to us. And this is where like these war metaphors start to be dangerous, because, if we're trying to understand our relationship to a microbe rather than just what it is, having metaphors like, they're a microbial foe. They're like a battle of soldiers. Like we need to fight them with. See, even just the word fight, like it's so subconscious, the metaphors. I sometimes I'm hyper aware of metaphor, and I'll say fight, or I'll say it's microbial warfare, or I'll say things like this because I have to describe my research sometimes, and I cringe after, because it's really framing that our relationship is antagonistic, really, to microbes. And so and I might go a little bit out of order and all over the place, but part of
No, go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, part of just to talk about like the history of that, like of why there was like this negative relationship, was because we've been in an antagonistic relationship with microbes for a while. We didn't know until we had this idea of germ theory, right? Where we're like, oh, it's actually microbes that are giving us the diseases that are making us sick, right? And so, of course, like as a first exposure to microbes being the ones that cause diseases, it seems like they're an enemy. And also, shortly after the time that penicillin was discovered, I think they were mass producing that antibiotic in like the early 40s. And so not only was there this idea of like these microbes are antagonistic with us because they hurt us, but also this was a time of like World War II, and a war like storyline was familiar to all of us, or at least all of the people at that time. Sorry, it was in around like the mid to late 40s. And so there was a lot of like sort of discourse around, oh, there's we've been fighting this battle with microbes, and we've now have like the silver bullet of penicillin, and there is this quote from somebody in the 40s, I'm trying to remember, but they said something like, we have to kind of domesticate and kind of exert dominance over them. And I think a lot of these early metaphors have this very like kind of Western colonial framing of domination and domestication. And so it was kind of another example of that, of like, here's this thing that is posing a threat to us. Let us domesticate it and wield control over it. And so it was framed as a power struggle kind of as well. And so what's interesting is that since then, we've started to, people started to realize that there's good microbes, and that good microbes are actually really important for our health, and actually important in this interplay between the bad ones for our health and the good ones. And basically it was found that our sterility, our efforts to eradicate all microbes was actually creating these health problems like allergies, asthma, autoimmune diseases. And so I think there became this shift of like, actually, we need our microbes, but now let's think about like how to get these good ones on our side. That's part of the kind of war metaphor. Actually, it was sort of co-opted and changed as our relationship to the microbes changed, right? So people started to say, oh, they're actually like on our side, and like now we need to build, like, think about them as a community. And even people started to talk about, well, actually, microbes aren't just part of us, like we are microbes. This started happening as like genome sequencing kind of began to take off, and like all the metaphors around understanding who we are, like through genomic terms or through our DNA. The metaphors that started out, like so a lot of what I'm talking about, I want to just give credit to Bridget Nerlich. She is an amazing like scientist and person who thinks about this specific topic a lot, microbes and metaphors. So a lot of what I'm drawing on, like, she has talked about too. So I just want to throw that out there. But basically, she has this paper that was recently published in 2015 that kind of gets at like how we understand ourselves and how we relate to microbes through metaphors. And she talks about, at first, like the Human Genome Project, which was a way of that people thought of, now we can understand ourselves through our genes, and it'll be like reading the book of God, was how people talked about it. Because of course, like, there's also a lot of really religious metaphors that carry over. So, that's kind of hinting that like we are made in the image of God and stuff like that, right? So we could understand the book of God. We could so just having it as a book too, like, keep that thought in your mind, and think about, now what can you do with a book? You can read a book. What does a book contain? It contains words that form sentences. Words are like discrete units. So you start like without even maybe realizing it, like mapping, like, okay, well, if we are a book, words are like genes, and like genes come together in sentences that are like chromosomes, and like they build to us. And so it was a way of like understanding that concept, but also constraining that, and constraining our understanding, because it was thinking about it in a very like kind of reductionist way, where it's like, there are genes, they are their own entities like words, and they make us up, and they can combine in cool ways, but they're their own things, and they're all us in our book. But then as the microbiome kind of research started, and as people explored genomes more, they realized that like, actually, there's a bunch of stuff in our genes that is not us at all. This is like a very common not only in our genomes, but, if you sequence our whole body, right, like that's considered a metagenome. It's all the DNA in us, right? More of it is foreign things. It's, or what we considered foreign, right? Like it's viruses, it's bacteria, because it's our microbiome, but also through our evolutionary past, viruses and other microbes we interacted with, like inserted their genes into our genomes. This is a thing called horizontal gene transfer. And so as we started to understand like how inextricably linked we are to microbes, it changed the dialogue actually a lot to being kind of metaphors around us being microbes. Like you'll have metaphors of like chimeras. We're like a chimeric thing. We're hybrids. We're composites, mosaics. And these metaphors, I think, are really cool in that they have to have the effect of positively framing your relationship to microbes because you are them. Unless you hate yourself, I guess. But like the idea is like, how can you wage war against yourself? Like, I think that that's kind of the change in how we viewed microbes, like how it's going towards that now, and it's redefining the idea of really a self and an individual in a way that is productive, I think, for our relationship with microbes and just productive in general for us to see that we are part of an integrated system. And this has been a theme too with in science, going from like understanding the world in a reductionist way to like systems biology, which is like understanding that everything is interconnected and there is no hierarchy. Actually, there is webs of things. And this gets into like ecological metaphors that I talk about in my paper, where I think we should have more ecological metaphors for, and we can talk about the paper a little more specifically later. But these metaphors that really highlight the interconnectedness, because for one, that shows that like what happens to one of us in this web will influence all of us. So it shows this kind of like shared fate. And when you have a shared fate with something, you're inherently going to want to like have a respectful relationship to that. So that was like a long-winded way of just kind of like talking about my interest in metaphors and how the different ones we have to talk about microbes can really change how we see them and how that's developed over time. Was there anything in there?
That's great. Like there were so many, I don't know, like hooks, let's say, where we could continue from. And
yeah, right.
I'm wondering what direction to go. But when you were talking, what made me think, what made me thinking is that maybe the metaphors we use, they also reflect the times we live in. So as you said, this the war metaphor regarding microbes came into being around World War II, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so if we are going to redefine the metaphor, we talk, for example, about microbes, like how it would reflect on the times we are living in right now. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely much more, because of also that we became much more interconnected because of technology. It's much easier to fly somewhere on the other corner of the world in very short time. We can talk now, we have like how many hours difference we have right now? Like we're really on the opposite parts of I think 10 hours. So I think it's much easier to realize how interconnected we are. And it made me wonder like, so maybe that's why we are so keen to look for metaphors which kind of express this interconnectedness of us and microbes or, between each other.
Yes. That's just, sorry, that's so interesting. I had never actually even thought about that. But I mean, you talk about a good point, which is that like the metaphors we use tell us a lot about ourselves in a given time and context as well, right? And you're so right. This like globalization that we have makes it harder to define like nation identities and like us as separate from each other, which was very much the frame and the metaphors people were using, even when they changed to describing bacteria as not like a bacterial enemy, but they said a bacterial nation that's separate from us, right? So these ideas of separateness are in these like national identities that remain apart. But now, yeah, like you're saying, the globalization.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we still have wars going on, and definitely the war metaphor will not so quickly disappear when we talk about microbes. But maybe here I would like to shift to this topic of antimicrobial resistance, which probably is seen the most in a war kind of a metaphor from many topics related to the microbes. And I wonder if you would like to tell a couple words in your own words. How do you understand what antimicrobial resistance is? And I would like you to try to explain it in a very simple way, like to somebody who never actually heard what is that.
Yes, I should be able to do this. Okay, so the way I would explain it is that antimicrobial resistance is when a microorganism can like when a microorganism that causes disease to us, we don't have any way of preventing or fighting. Oh, see, I said fighting. The metaphors, they're so inherent. Okay, I'm starting over. It sucks because when you're hyper aware of it, but then you do it, it's just okay. So I would say antimicrobial resistance is a process in which the bacteria or other microorganisms that we interact with are when they cause disease and we cannot mitigate that disease anymore. And so it's a process of evolution. It's a process where there exists. So what's important to evolution is like three things. There has to exist some sort of variation, right? So we have a bunch of different microbes. I'll actually explain it through maybe like more of a gardening metaphor, where it's like we maybe have a bunch of different plants in our garden. And, maybe some are better for the drought, some are better for rainy conditions. They all have their variation that makes them unique. And maybe it's a really dry year in where you live, like it is in California here. And only your drought tolerant plants live and all the other ones don't make it, right? So now you have a way smaller diversity of plants in your garden, and mostly just these drought tolerant ones. And so what happens now is that they can basically flourish, right? There's nothing competing with them. All the plants around them are kind of dead, and they just can take up all that space with themselves and get stronger and bigger. And so this is like the problem of antimicrobial resistance, because instead of the weather, like the drought conditions being the selective force, we are that selective force when we give like a penicillin or some kind of pill that actually kills almost every microbe. They're not targeted really. So it's not like it's just trying to kill one enemy or anything. It's killing all the bacteria it can. And so it's going to be like this drought tolerant plant where maybe there will just be one that can make it, and that one is now going to have no competition because there's not going to be any other microbes around it that it has to share food with or space with, so it can just increase rapidly. And so once it does that, now you have a whole garden, let's say, of drought tolerant plants. And now there will be some variation in that even, right? Where some are going to be even more drought tolerant than the other. And so even if you think, okay, well, I'll just keep trying to get rid of them. Now my metaphor is breaking down because
I love it. I just love it. I am like,
See,
wow,
this
and
is
what
what's so fun
next?
about metaphors is that like you kind of start and then you just keep mapping. You're like, okay, does this map to this? Like, and then sometimes it doesn't. And that's when you have to be careful with their metaphor. But yeah, I think that's a useful one because it gets at the process, right? Where the process is inevitable. The process is evolution. Like there will always be a selective force. It's natural. It's just that we as humans are the ones imposing this force like so much at a so much faster and stronger rate than would be natural. So that like we're basically eliminating any other competition that could prevent this from happening. And when we eliminate everything around it, that becomes the ecological part of the metaphor because that's another thing that we have to think about with antimicrobial resistance. It's a big problem because we're losing the diversity of microbes that keep those ones in check. And that, if you think about ways that people can go about protecting themselves from getting sick. Now we've shifted the paradigm away from germ theory, I think, a little bit away from germ theory, where it's not like sterilize everything you have, because that's like giving an antibiotic, right? Like you sterilize everything you have, well, everything's going to be gone except the strongest ones. And so now I think the discourse is more like actually help the other members of the community so that they have a chance in this competition against the antimicrobially resistant one, right? So it's like, okay, water those other plants that like maybe can't handle the drought. Like help them stay healthy so they can keep the other ones in check.
You made it. This is great. I am impressed. I love this metaphor. But now it made me thinking. So how we can water the other plants in this metaphor? What it would be?
Yeah, I love this. Okay, yeah. So there's a few ways. So there's a really great book actually by I can't remember who it's by. It's called We're Never Home Alone. Let me see. Never Home Alone. It's by Rob Dunn. And he writes all about like the microbes in our homes and all this stuff. And something he talks about a lot is basically trying to always be in contact with a diversity of microbes. And you hear this, repeated, I think, a lot nowadays with this idea, which I think is really good, is that diversity is good. That's like part of our storyline right now. So the thing about metaphors is that they can symbolize a storyline of a culture, like we're talking about the storyline of war and stuff like that. So I think we're in a really awesome place right now to like recognize that diversity is good and the diversity like helps us flourish. And so it's kind of along those lines of like eat diverse foods so that you get diverse microbes in your diet. Open up your windows. This is what he talks about in the book, where apparently opening up your windows can let like other microbes from the environment into your house. They can go on your surfaces and they can take up space that maybe pathogenic microbes would have taken up that would cause disease. And so it's thinking about it's just constantly staying in this like ecological framework of like, instead of eliminating one bad one, water the other ones, bring them all in. And I guess the way to keep them healthy or to water them really is to like feed them, right? Like if we think about our gut microbiome, we want to bring in, we want to eat fermented foods. We want to eat a diversity of foods that can serve as different prebiotics for our different microbes. We want to bring in a variety of food to bring in microbes from a variety of food sources, from potatoes like that are in the earth, that are in the soil, to fruits that have a different microbiome. And because if you think about stuff as having different microbiomes and being part of like the microbes in that thing are their own ecosystem that has withstood different selective pressures from each other, right? Like you think about microbes on a fruit. That's going to be microbes that are exposed to the sun and the wind, and they have been shaped by their own history and story, and evolutionary past. And then that's different from the ones in the soil that have been shaped by, maybe competition with other things in soil. It's very like diverse in soil, and there's darkness and there's water and there's nitrogen. And so what you get when you bring in a diversity of substrates into your body, for example, is all these different microbes that have evolved under very different conditions and that have different strengths and stuff. So you're creating all this variation in your body that's important for keeping a healthy ecosystem, and for just having a variety of different options for selection to kind of favor and act on. So I guess, I don't know if that helps answer. I guess, keeping basically this ecological perspective and trying to bring in as much diversity as you can into your bodies, into your house. And yeah, I think that's the best thing you could do, instead of focusing on eliminating one thing, because that one microbial foe will kind of be very elusive. It will always come back, even if you try it, because it's a result of the process. So you can never kill an individual like enemy. It's always going to be about promoting a context in which it can't become too much, like an enemy can't arise, rather than trying to kill it.
Thank you for this perspective. I actually never thought about it, because I was more thinking like the only way how we can tackle it is, for example, by a little bit more conscious way of dealing with things which are antimicrobial, like antibiotics or some, I don't know, whatever else we use to kill microbes. But you brought up this topic of like strengthening the ones which might be endangered, let's say.
And I mean, I don't want to not talk about the like conscious antibiotic usage, because that actually is also really important. And that's like getting at the part of like, thinking about the selective force you're imposing, because that is the pill, the antibiotic, right, is this strong selective force, right? And so there's different like perspectives that you can think about this, right? As like keep the community, of course, but then also if you are smart about when you use that selective force, and to not overuse it, or to not use it in contexts that you don't need it, right? Like in agriculture, instead of using an antibiotic as a preventative, like people are doing, only use it when there's actually disease, right? Because when there's actually disease, there is this already natural overabundance of maybe a microbe that's like harming the animal, right? And so then it's an appropriate thing to try to select that one out, right? Instead of a preventative measure that's just killing everything. So I think that's a really good point. I'm glad like that you bring it up, just to also just think about being conscious of using antibiotics, not using them preventatively, and using them only when you have a bacterial infection, like, and not take them unnecessarily for viruses and other things like that. So,
and here in this way, the diversity of microbes becomes the metaphor for the importance of diversity at large. So it kind of comes back to macro world, let's say. It made me think about exactly this macro level of these issues with metaphors around microbes, and how things like, for example, antibiotics are being marketed through those metaphors, right?
Yes.
Actually, I don't know what would be my question here, but to me, antimicrobial resistance is an interesting example of like how like a systemic, like a huge, worldwide corporations are kind of intermingled with microbes. So something which we cannot see, like these both dimensions, which are kind of beyond our perception, are kind of interconnected and kind of playing around together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, definitely like metaphors are rhetorical devices as well, right? Like when you think about it in advertising and stuff like that, like they do prime us to like feel a certain way. I mean, this is something I think about a lot is just the priming and framing effects of metaphors. Like we talked about before, you know, what was our example before where, oh yeah, with the bugs, right? Like when I used the metaphor bugs, it framed it so that the quality that you were focusing on was size, right? So a metaphor.
But there is something more, I
Uh-huh.
think, there, because also bags are a little bit yucky, right? It's something like
Oh yeah, yeah,
that for
you're right.
most people. And I think bacteria are also ought to be this one.
Yes, yes, you're so right. It's funny, I'm so biased because I study like bugs, the insects, and I forget people think they're gross. I study both type of bugs, so I love them. But you're so right, like the ickiness, right? So yeah, and actually that's a really good point too, because the metaphor has this affect that it creates in you to be like, ew, right? Like that's an emotional response. And so I think advertising and popular media is always kind of trying to get at that affective response because that's what makes people buy stuff or, makes people read stuff, right? So, it was interesting. I learned that like the top headlines for like what got clicked the most of articles were articles that told the reader how they were going to feel when they read this article. So it's really, they're like, you're not going to, like, you're going to be shocked at what you see. Like those kinds of headlines, right? That tell you how you're going to feel when you read it. Um, yeah, I think where did I read that? There's a book Calling Bullshit. I think that's what they talked about in that book, I think. But it's so interesting all the stuff that goes into advertising because it really is like trying to get at an affect for you. It's like how you feel in the moment you read that. And so a metaphor is a really great shortcut for doing that, right? Like it immediately gives you an affective response. And so that is also the power of metaphors, whether good or bad, is that you immediately tell someone how they should feel about something. And I think that actually is part of the problem of catastrophic metaphors in science communication. I think Nerlich talks about this as well. I think she wrote this paper about catastrophe metaphors. And she talks about global warming as well, or climate change. And, you see this all over this like very fear-inducing, sensationalized conversation around basically like existential threats, right? Like antimicrobial resistance, global warming. And so, I don't know if there was someone who was like, oh, we should intentionally make these like very like fear-inducing metaphors, but it's clear that like there seemed to be some some motivation to make people afraid because we thought, like, I think scientists thought that if you make people afraid, they'll do something about it, right? Like, people use like kind of fear tactics a lot to try to get what they want. And so I think that's something that was happening with the metaphors around antimicrobial resistance and global warming. It was to be like, this is an existential threat. These things are going to kill us. You should be afraid. That was kind of the response. But, I think about this a lot from a science communication perspective of like, is fear going to motivate? Or is fear going to unmotivate? Right? And, there's different contexts in which it will do either, right? Like with something as large and kind of not super tangible as like climate change and like what we can do to stop that, it feels almost like it's like depressing. You have this, you're really scared, but there's nothing you can do about it, and you just have to wait, right? Like, because that's kind of, it's such a large problem that no one person can tackle it. So that fear isn't super useful. But then you'll start to see, like, which I think is really important for effective like climate change communication, is that they'll put like action items at the end, right? Where it's like, okay, like this is a horrible thing, like you should be scared, but here's like 5 things you could do at home. And so, it gives the reader like some kind of like, okay, like there's at least something I could do. So I think that's like important if you're going to use fear-inducing metaphors, is just to try and end on an inspiring and agency affirming note, like that we have some control over this. And I'll just give one more example of, like, for climate change, there was this effort to use music to convey the kind of existential threat and the sadness of our Earth disappearing and stuff, or the life on Earth disappearing. And there was this like piano player that was like playing on like a melting iceberg, and he's playing this like really sad song on this piece of ice, like drifting through the Arctic as it melts. And it's like, it's great because it's like art and music is very powerful as far as like making us feel either motivated or unmotivated, or some kind of feeling about these scientific things. But what does that leave you with besides just like a depressing mood, right? There's no action item where he like stands up on the iceberg and is like, you can stop this.
But check this out. Now I'm thinking about this analog, because global warming and antimicrobial resistance. However, antimicrobial resistance is not so media popular, let's say, at all. It's kind of a niche topic, but they are seen as equally devastating and kind of dangerous processes, kind of unstoppable and so on. And I started to imagine how this video would look for the antimicrobial resistance.
Oh my god!
What it would be? Let's brainstorm on that. So for global warming, we have a man. I suppose it was a white man playing piano on that melting iceberg. He's playing a sad music. I'm sorry to be so ironic. But, I also feel like those narratives, they come from people who will be the least impacted by those processes, because both antimicrobial resistance and global warming will hit first on the least privileged people, not those people who have money to bring the piano to Antarctic and put the man play that music there. I don't know. It makes me feel angry, actually. I'm now scandalized a bit. I think I saw this video you were referring to. But it just really made me wonder, like, what would be that video clip for antimicrobial resistance? Gosh, how to communicate the drama of that. This is crazy.
It's going to be really important to think about who's affected by it and bring them into the creation of this in a way that will make that, because the thing about metaphors is that they're only useful if they have some kind of mapping to our experiences, right? Like if we're trying to understand a microbe and we use stuff like war, I mean, like a lot of us here like have not lived through war, right? And so even with metaphors, there's this famous metaphor in evolutionary biology that is about like these spandrels of San Marcos. I don't know if you've heard of this. Stephen Jay Gould, he had this metaphor where he's like, there's these spandrels, and I didn't even know what a spandrel was. A spandrel is like it's an architectural thing in a building. Like nobody understands what that is in the first place. How can you use that as a metaphor to understand evolution, right? So he's using these metaphors that are not very like kind of like widely understood by a diversity of people, right? It's a very eclectic group of like intellectuals probably. It's exclusive, right? Your metaphor is exclusive in that case. So I think it's important to think about inclusive metaphors, because the metaphor is, you have to have an inclusive metaphor if you're going to relate to a diverse group of people on these concepts, and a diverse group of people that are affected by these things. And if your metaphor is something they can't relate to, then it's not going to stick, and it's not going to create an affect, and it's not going to create any kind of like motivation, I think. I mean, I might be being a little bit too dramatic about this, but I think, yeah, I think it's important.
Very interesting. I still wanted to ask you so many questions. So first of all, I really wanted to hear about those bee microbiomes, but I just think let's do another episode about it.
Yeah, that's for later. Let's talk metaphors.
This was such an incredible fun. I didn't know we will crack up so much talking about antimicrobial resistance, because it's quite serious topic.
Right. But it's just too much fun talking about metaphors. They get so silly, you can't help it. But,
exactly. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. And the garden metaphor was fantastic. I was really, I will think about it.
Well, definitely like try to improve it too, because I kind of just thought of it on the fly, and there's some stuff that doesn't map 1-to-1 exactly. So, yes, garden metaphor, but also thinking of new metaphors all the time and seeing what I feel like. That's what we need to be doing, is just changing our metaphors as we interact in the world and seeing how we see things differently and what metaphors come out of that and stuff. So we'll start with the garden and see where that goes.
We are chimeras, hybrids, mosaics, and composites. Microbes are not just a part of us. We are microbes too. Therefore, metaphors around microbes mirror our human condition. The importance of inclusive and not polarizing metaphors for diverse groups of people is crucial. Are there any microbial metaphors, besides the garden metaphor, of course, that come to your mind after listening to this episode? We would love to hear them. My name is Aga Pokrywka, and I'm always happy to receive feedback from Ferment Radio listeners. Our inbox is always open. You can send your comments, questions, and suggestions to hello@fermentradio.com. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. This episode of Ferment Radio is produced in Helsinki by Super Eclectic, a multimedia production team for the world we want, and supported by Empowering Tools, a residency program of the Erasmus Plus project, and Riboka Repository of Knowledge, co-financed by the European Union. The European Commission is not responsible for the content of this publication.